A curious perfume and a most melodious twang has been said to have accompanied the departure of a certain daimon or spirit or some kind of imp. But one can see, and so I want to connect this up to the Romantics. I've been probed, as it were, to invent a word like portmanteau. I've been probed, by which I mean to say not simply pushed into doing it by a provocation, but also that there was some kind of selbst action that's to be involved there, and the provocation is a prob. But that's just a piece of ad hoc technical apparatus. But the reason I do that is because I want to show that when we're building these new words, like portmanteau was once a new word, we kind of jostle something that's neither poetic in the sense that a poet is somebody that gives us a wise vision, is the basic older sense, a Dante, Shakespeare. But it's neither is it merely the activity of a clever person or a classicist. But I think the phrase that I uttered right at the beginning is obviously not simply a poetic thing. It has something of like, I think of people like Bryce Martin who wear a shore worker, like on the waterfront type of cap. He's dead now, I think, but he did. And up to a point, I come from this type of people myself. This California, San Francisco Art Institute type of education, Leslie shows and things like that. It's never really, it's not the real thing, because it always, we have a commitment to some kind of workers' movements in connection to the murals and in Coy Tower and in connection to all this type of stuff. But actually, since the art world has changed so much and it's all about self-marketing and it's all about Tracy Ullman type of stuff, by which I don't mean to say salacious things, but what I mean to say is this sort of self-building of a person, which Cindy Sherman kind of puts as lit in a way, in her own way. But this type of thing where we have a statement like that, and then we have which is sort of like a classicist statement, but like it has the rhythm of a classicist who's trying to be a bit like those Bryce Martin paintings that have something beautiful in it that twang at the end. It's a nice statement, but it's not really a poetic statement. Whereas when Keats is saying, and when the Romantic English are saying, poets are saying, which are so totally different from the what we mean by Romanticism in connection to Heinrich Heine's Triebnacht und Endlichkeit, which has a specific philosophic sense, and which is exactly what the Catholics are opposed to when for instance, when Pope Francis wrote his first encyclical that mentioned Nietzsche and Nietzsche's endless ways, Triebnacht und Endlichkeit, rather than the drive to completion, the classical drive to the Sacred Heart. I should say the classical drive was to completion, but the drive to the Sacred Heart is the reinterpretation as the drive to perfection. That's the difference between. That's one way to chart the difference between Socrates as an erotic man and this kind of Christian tradition as interpreted according to the reading of the Song of Songs by the early church father who interpreted Eros into agape, whose name is flying right now, but this all charms fly from the cold touch of philosophy. This saying is obviously a poetic thing. Keats saying is obviously a poetic thing. It's not simply there for the curious words in the phrase. So let's start with that basis, and then let's ask, what does it mean that what's the wisdom in the saying that the charms have flown from the cold touch of philosophy? What it means is that Keats is thinking of this specifically modern philosophy, which eventually links up to the so-called saying of the disenchanted world by Weber and things like that. So let's locate originally this charm in Eigenlichkeit, or in authenticity. So Kristen Stewart has said, so I have to take some liberty. I'm not exactly sure on everything, but she could be questioned more closely. But I think when she says quite frequently that, speaking of herself, that we're the type of ones that are here, we're with you, we're available right now, I think what she is thinking ultimately of is she's taking the interpretation of Steinbeck's East of Eden, where some characters, Steinbeck, as in Cal, the one played by James Dean, the guy that made the money speculating on the markets, is said to be, he just wants to live. He's here now. He just wants to live. And then some other characters are described as living in the future. So that there's a juxtaposition, somewhat like the juxtaposition. Steinbeck does his own version of something like a juxtaposition between a reflective and an active attitude, or extroverted, introverted attitude. So I think this is the same thing as I would want to superimpose onto the Socratic sort of miracle, as it were, and say, when we go from Sittlichkeit, and as Hegel thematizes it, or the way things are being done, or the unauthentic, and we jump into the Socratic challenging of everything, which we regard as the life worth living, as the Jowett translation puts it. I think what does the original say? It says something like a anthropos. There's this taking the A to be, the way people like to say it is privative, but to allow in no part the human. You only bring in the human when you're doing this investigation like we're doing right now. So you bring in the human in that sense, and that's the best. That's the question. Is it, if you say best, then you're more utilitarian. If you say Eigenlichkeit or autonomous, if you say this is the autonomous position, then you seem to rise higher into a claim about the truth. So if you have this position, and it's sort of exemplified properly by Socrates, who was executed because he stirred things up, and he said, you guys are just you're acting in sort of surga, or so-called concern, but it's really you're acting in your daily the mode of your daily dealings, and you aren't awakening to the real human activity of investigation. So, which is so needful in a moment when there's all kinds of fastness, or like rapidity in the political situation. So let's look at it again. There's Sittlichkeit. So Socrates is at the center, and then there's the Sittlichkeit. So for example, take the word. So we're just talking about the best. So take the word Aristos, which is the chief thing under discussion. I mean, besides Dike and justice, in a way, is the center. But there's a lot of talk about the Aristos eidos in the Politeia, or the Republic. So the Aristos means originally the best, but the immediate example of it would have been for an Athenian totally different than for us. It would have been this sort of, well, it's interesting. Let's flatten it, actually. Let's think it that way. So supposing it's the same, it would have been people who were sort of gangsters involved in vendettas and powerful families with private bodyguards, not exactly Praetorian guards, but more informal and more ruthless. And then everybody else wouldn't have had any means to, their only access to the law would have then been to go to these big families and say, oh, look in your rune books or your lore. I don't want to disparage rune books or lore per se, but I'm just, what I was trying to signal was these people no longer believed in their rune books or lore, and instead when people would come to them, ask for remedy for the law, let make me whole again, something's happened, what they would do is come out with their own interpretations. And then, so Aristotle has said this is why there's a kind of attack on the pre-philosophic view in Aristotle, which says the gods are just these toys of the wealthy, basically. So in that atmosphere, you get this, the best seems to mean these people, which for us would be, I know it's anathema, a lot of people can't possibly think it, but it would be Donald Trump and the Trumps. If you say the election is made, if you say, I know it's ridiculous for a Californian to think of this way, not for all Californians, but for quite a few. For Gavin Newsom, I think, to think of Trump as the best of the country, but the formula would be like this. What's an election? Is an election democratic or aristocratic? And some people, and so this is already an ancient question, so some people would say it's aristocratic because it's a means to choose the Aristos, or the best of the, so this is like it would be the best of the Americans. So then therefore Trump must be, by that virtue, the best of the Americans. But in this case, it wasn't decided by an election, but it had been decided by Fortuna, or as it were, accidents of birth. Whoever was born into those top wealthy families was de facto the Aristos. And then what Plato Socrates are discussing in the Republic is, what would a real Aristos be like? With that deep trick there, it's like, well, aren't those actually the genuine ones? And then you get that funny thing it's funny, it's not immediately obvious that you get two different opinions that amount to the same thing. One says the law is whatever the strong say it is, and then another says the law is whatever is on the book, currently being promulgated and on the books. But since those two are, you could distinguish them intellectually, but they're also de facto, they may be the same, and they were the same at the time that the Politeia was written. So you get this problem where you're splitting from, then you could say, the Eigenlichkeit or Socratic view, which is then more in the direction as, we have to think of it sort of overlaying things. It's not exactly the same, but it's like if the first beginning had a version and it was in the vernacular, and then if Socrates had a version and it came out in a more clear and concise thought form in the what's usually translated as the Republic and so on, then you say if the same type of question is treated by Kant, it gets called autonomy, by Heidegger, Eigenlichkeit, but all kinds of things have changed here. And so then we want to say in the other parts of the tradition, there's different problems. So, but why? And then so Strauss gives one position, and he says there's this big break because there's a number of the level of dubitation has exploded beyond all reason. So the Cartesian omnibus dubitandum, of course, this type of dubitation, which is presented as though it were connected to a whole system of thought, which eventually brings about the possibility of setting up the Cartesian grid, which is so important. It's translation between algebra and arithmetic/geometry. This is very important, and it sequences the sort of the infinity vanishing point. Like as in my story about the philosopher on Substack, it sequences that vanishing point, but when it does it, it leaves something that could be reinterpreted. So it's like it shows a moment where attack became the everyday, unauthentic, daily dealings routine, and the taken for granted situation, which in a certain way, one can just reflect on that situation, or one can also be more rapidly a part of it. And this is part of the issue. And then the issue of the unauthentic and the authentic, which we were saying in the other video, we could center in one way on Kant's manifold of acts, or the Vielfältig Handlungen. I don't know if he actually says it exactly that way, but he does say Handlungen for the acts, meaning an act which has a kind of a pronoun-bearing entity at the center of it. So that's the question here too. Here's this pronoun-bearing entity, and then you could see those two different categories Kristen Stewart raises, and I think on the basis of her own sort of taking up and then re-understanding this, the way Steinbeck deals with it. So you could see there how the pronoun-bearing entity, so-called, would also be at the center of any analysis of so-called history, or where you took historiology, where you took... you don't even have to take historiology in Hegel's sense seriously yet. You just say, we have to take seriously that these people had different emotions than we do, at least in the sense they modulated them differently. They responded to things differently, as the standards of beauty are different in different eras, for instance. And then many other things echoing on that same subject. But you could see kind of the tonality of it in the difference between the people who live in the future and the people that are there. Oh, we're here with you, we're here now, except as Kristen Stewart describes herself. You could see a different tonality in those type of senses. And what Strauss is saying is we suffered a kind of a hit in a tone that's like that, and it amounts to, I connected up with the vanishing point because of course that easily links to the Goethean interpretation and the Faustian, according to Spengler and so on. But I think the reason I choose it is more that it links up to the Cartesian grid. That's what it makes me think of. And I think that whole view of the inertial frame of reference, and people like to speak of the political inertia as being the duplicate of the deep state and things like that. The inertia, breaking the inertia, which Steve Bannon is sort of like I think more like he's somebody in the battlefield, sort of like you think of Iliad or whatever. He's not the Ajax or the bulwark of us. He's more like a guy who's encouraging people a lot. He's not the big, strongest one, but he's the one that's trying to encourage people on the actual battlefield. Whereas then there's another, there's an element that he doesn't have, which is that it's the reflectivity, which looks at the battlefield as though from outside, and then deals with all these issues. You could have both, but you could also focus on one aspect. It's not. Maybe it's even better. Maybe you'll be better in that aspect if you're more focused. I don't know. That's like saying maybe the ancient, maybe the Argives or the Greeks that took part in the Trojan War, that were connected to Achilles. Maybe, yeah, they were better at what they did because I could see that because their physicality is more direct, like those goats that do those crazy jumps all over the place and do. And it's because of, they're in a different zone in that sense. So taken from that position, Strauss is saying, why is it really cogent to make these ultimate doubts and to go over to the Cartesian view, which creates if you say the omnibus tandem is basically to say it sets the new direction for the hard problem of consciousness. Even Chalmers is a lot confused when he tries to do any history on that, and he doesn't know exactly where to start it. Of course, he suspects Descartes, but then he says maybe it's not quite there in Descartes. And I think that's right, actually. But he's intelligent, so he just gropes around, but he has absolutely no philological skills. But he just starts where he grew up and what they told him. But he gropes around and finds it, I think. So, but I think the issue is that you can't simply say this notion of the pronoun, the I, having being there no matter what. So like not even nothing, as Heidegger says, nothings, but being there, like looking at everything through a glass, and then the everything. So then the transhumanism becomes obvious from that point of view in a way, because we're looking at everything through the glass, and we're already in the simulation by that way of thinking about it, instead of being in the world. What does that mean more? But it's important to look at what that means more exactly, and not what it means just from a sort of vague subjective point of view. But what it means, at least empirically, is a certain direction of study connected to a certain way of understanding what space is and how to, in Newton, quantify it. There's a great book on that, by the way, by Burt, B-U-R-T-T, on the metaphysics of modern physical sciences. And then I think at the same point, Strauss is saying in Hobbes, the use of death, the fear of death really, and death as the main wellspring for all law is similarly not cogent, but in this case he says because it's just not really the case, because people often are willing to die because of some belief or because of some it's kind of hard to just speak of life preservation for a being that's not an animal, I guess. Because if you're like an animal and you're in a fight to the death, you're in a fight to the death. But if you're a human being, there's the manifold of acts is active. So that's kind of what Heidegger wants to say with his way of dealing with death. I think in a way is one part of the manifold of acts is this awareness that Dasein is mortal. But the whole manifold of acts basically means we have all kinds of other commitments, things we're thinking about. Oh, I can't die now because, but we also have, oh, I will die now because, in the case of a Christian martyr, for instance, in the case of, or this act can never be done, even if I have to die because they don't do it, or just, there's other things. There's a whole world of other directions that are already in the what Heidegger's calling the Geworfen Verwenheit, or the thrownness of our manifold of sort of commitments to things. And then those are already active and there. So there's both, there's not just being here, there's also sort of commitments, and there's also a way to break in to the ground where Socrates broke in, where the already going commitments can be challenged in a way that fulfills what Goethe said about when we anyone who takes an action is contracts Schuld. So it's kind of like a karma theory. If you're doing Eigenlichkeit, or genuine action, rather than the customary way of doing, rather than, as it were, hiding in the customary way of doing things, or sleeping in it, or whatever, then there's a direct guilt. This could be interpreted in many ways, actually, and I think maybe Heidegger, there could be a problem there for Heidegger, I think, because there's both unpleasant and pleasant taking a stand on one's existence, as it were, and there's a range, and there's sort of personalities that are constantly exposed to those things in different levels of pleasantness and unpleasantness. There's a bunch of problems in here. But one issue I wanted to just end on, I guess, is that I think we could say in Hegel, where he's going back and forth between the Sittlichkeit and the Socratic sort of morality, or phronesis, which I say morality because through the cycle of changes we get phronesis in Socrates, symbiosis in the Middle Ages in Thomas, and then morality, and then the Victorian age sort of makes morality have a bad name in a certain sense. Or at least the ending of the Victorian, when it's looking at the Victorian age in retrospective as ourselves somehow, as our something still left in our Sittlichkeit, or inauthenticity, or in our in our lack of grasping of the already going manifold of actions. And Hegel raises this up through the historical process to say, now we no longer need any kind of breaking into this record that's been engaged by history. And I think that this, it's interesting if we try to, so it's like, sometimes, so of course Fukuyama tried to interpret that as the ultimate victory of liberalism, but I think in a way Dugin, he just stays on, it's not really a criticism, but in a way Dugin just stays on Fukuyama's level, and he says, no, you're mistaken. The aristocracy as described by Hegel is basically like the truth. And to give that some cogency, so that you could say Dugin's made a counterclaim about the end of history. Fukuyama made his claim in 89 or so. Huntington responded to his own student a couple of years later. And then Dugin, after talking to all these people, including Baczynski and all those guys, the grand chessboard guy, came out with his version and said, well, no, you're almost right, but and so here's one way I would link up Dugin's position, though he doesn't argue it this way, but I think he maybe is somewhat sympathetic to it, is if you do it from a kind of Frankfurt School side, I think you would say about the time of World War I, there was this moment when the Weimar started becoming flooded with management culture. So Owen in the I should give a shout out to Owen in the Agon, who this is one of his big themes, is management culture. But so when the management culture comes in, that means at the same time aristocratic culture goes out. So you could see that in Man Without Qualities, the Musil book, for instance, right at the beginning of the book. In Austria, how the situation was in Austria, where they're so happy to still have the king, unlike this. It's like on the day before World War I starts, I think the book takes place. But it's kind of like they could see from Austria how fucked up it is once you get into a bureaucratic management society, and they're very happy they still had their aristocrat at the top. So that would be kind of the this sweet flavored candied way to get into the subject, I think, and take Dugin's side seriously. And then that would mean to look at how do we understand reading Hegel's version, Hegel's political philosophy of the constitutional monarchy type that he wanted, into the current situation. And then it's true, so we already have an example with England, but then you have to ask, to what extent are we dealing with dead formalities and things that are mocked regularly by Stephen Fry and probably by types like Piers Morgan and so on. But you'd have to see what would Hegel's, if the Hegel's type of constitutional monarchy was brought into being, which you could readily imagine it happened more in Russia than almost anywhere else, because the mentality is more thoughtful. It's more like the German mentality, rather than the Trump type, Bannon type of thing, which is totally the opposite. Or as close to the opposite as you can get. You have to ask how that would really look if it's kept to the spirit of it rather than this disfigured quote unquote constitutional monarchy, which is of course really run by the prime minister. Although there's the conspiracy theories about the power of the royals and so on, but in England.